The sound still haunts my dreams, a high-pitched wail that cut through the morning mist like a blade through silk. I had no idea that walking into Riverside Park that October morning would change not just my life, but the hearts of an entire community. The cry I heard wasn't human, yet it carried more pain and desperation than any voice I'd ever encountered. I can still feel the damp grass beneath my feet, still smell the earthy scent of fallen leaves mixed with something else, something metallic, something wrong. What I discovered that morning, tangled in wire and fear, would teach me that sometimes the smallest creatures carry the biggest lessons about hope, compassion, and what it truly means to be human. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now? And which city or state are you watching from? My name is Sarah, and 3 months ago, I was just another face in the crowd. At 28, I worked a desk job that felt more like a prison sentence. Every morning, I'd drag myself out of bed, pour coffee that tasted like disappointment, and trudge through another day of spreadsheets and meaningless meetings. My life had become a series of routines, each one more suffocating than the last. The only escape I had was my morning walks through Riverside Park. It wasn't much, just a small patch of green nestled between the concrete jungle of our city, but it was mine. For 30 minutes each day, I could pretend I was somewhere else, somewhere where the air didn't taste like exhaust fumes and where silence wasn't drowned out by car horns and construction noise. That particular morning felt different from the moment I stepped outside. The October air carried a crispness that made my skin tingle, and the sky wore that peculiar shade of gray that promised either rain or something extraordinary. I chose the latter, though I had no idea how right I would be. I had been taking the same route for almost 2 years, down Maple Street, left at the old oak tree with the carved initials, through the park entrance where Mrs. Chin always fed the pigeons, and along the winding path that led to the small pond where a family of ducks had made their home. It was predictable, safe, and completely unremarkable. But that morning, something pulled me off my usual path. Maybe it was the way the morning light filtered through the canopy of trees, creating dancing shadows that seemed to beckon me deeper into the park. Maybe it was the unusual quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. Or maybe it was destiny, though I've never been one to believe in such things. I found myself walking toward the eastern section of the park, an area I'd always avoided because it felt wilder, less maintained. The city council had let this park grow natural, they said, a small sanctuary for wildlife in the heart of urban chaos. The paths here were narrow and overgrown, marked more by the footsteps of deer than human visitors. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the city faded away. My footsteps crunched softly on a carpet of gold and crimson leaves, and my breath formed small clouds in the cool air. There was something magical about being the only person in this forgotten corner of the world, something that made me feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. That's when I heard it. The first cry was so faint, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A thin, desperate sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stopped walking and listened, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't explain. The park fell silent around me, as if every bird, every insect, every blade of grass was waiting. Then it came again, louder this time, more urgent, a sound that shot straight through my chest and lodged itself somewhere near my heart. It was the sound of pure terror, of pain beyond understanding, of something small and helpless calling out to a world that had forgotten how to listen. I started running. My sneakers slipped on the wet leaves as I crashed through the underbrush, following that heartbreaking cry like a compass needle pointing toward true north. Branches caught at my jacket, thorns scratched at my arms, but none of that mattered. Something was suffering, and every second I delayed might be too late. The cries grew louder, more frequent, more desperate. They seemed to be coming from a small clearing up ahead, where the morning sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. My lungs burned as I pushed through the last of the undergrowth and stumbled into the open space. What I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing, barely visible among the fallen leaves and morning shadows, was a small patch of rust-colored fur. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a discarded stuffed animal, the kind a child might lose during a family picnic. But then it moved, and the cry came again, and I realized what I was looking at. A baby fox. But this wasn't the peaceful wildlife encounter I might have expected in a city park. This was something far more sinister, far more heartbreaking. The little creature was trapped, tangled in something that glinted silver in the dappled sunlight. Wire. Thin, cruel wire that had been twisted into a snare. My knees nearly gave out as the full horror of the situation hit me. Someone had set a trap in this peaceful sanctuary. Someone had deliberately placed instruments of torture where innocent creatures came to find food, water, and safety. The thought made my stomach turn and my hands clench into fists. The baby fox couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its fur was that gorgeous russet color that made foxes look like living flames, but it was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. One of its tiny paws was caught in the wire snare, twisted at an angle that made me wince, but it was its eyes that nearly broke me. Those eyes held an intelligence that seemed impossible for such a young creature. They were dark amber, flecked with gold, and filled with a pain that went beyond the physical. This little being understood what had happened to it. It knew it was trapped, knew it was hurt, and worst of all, it knew it was alone. When our eyes met across that small clearing, something passed between us. A recognition, perhaps, a plea, or maybe just the simple acknowledgement that in this moment, we were the only two creatures in the world who mattered. The fox tried to move toward me, and the movement sent another wave of those heartbreaking cries into the morning air. The wire tightened around its paw, and I could see fresh blood beginning to seep through its fur. Every movement was causing more damage, but the little creature couldn't help itself. It was scared, in pain, and probably hadn't eaten or had water for who knows how long. I dropped to my knees at the edge of the clearing, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had to help. There was no question about that, but I had no idea how. I wasn't a veterinarian or a wildlife expert. I was just a woman with a desk job who happened to take a wrong turn on her morning walk. But looking into those amber eyes, I knew that none of that mattered. Sometimes, life puts you exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. Sometimes the universe conspires to make you the right person for the job, whether you feel qualified or not. I reached for my phone to call for help, and my heart sank. No signal, of course. I was too deep in the park, too far from civilization. The fox cried again, softer this time, and I realized it was getting weaker. How long had it been trapped here? Hours? Days? The thought made my chest tight with panic. I had to act. Now I started talking to the little fox as I slowly moved closer, keeping my voice soft and steady, even though my hands were shaking. "Hey there, little one. I'm here now. I'm going to help you, okay? I know you're scared, and I know it hurts, but I'm not going to leave you." The fox watched me with those intelligent eyes, its small chest rising and falling rapidly. I could see it was trying to decide whether I was friend or foe, whether I was another threat or possibly its salvation. Trust, I realized, would be everything. I inched closer, moving with the kind of patience I never knew I possessed. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured. The fox never took its eyes off me, but something in its expression began to change. The wild panic started to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. When I was finally close enough to touch, I could see the full extent of the damage. The wire snare was cruelly simple but devastatingly effective. It was designed to tighten when the animal struggled, which meant that every movement the fox had made trying to escape had only made its situation worse. The wire had cut deep into the fur and skin around its right front paw, and I could see swelling that suggested the circulation had been cut off for some time. But what broke my heart more than the physical damage was the exhaustion I could see in the fox's small body. It had fought so hard for so long that it was running on nothing but stubborn will to live. Its breathing was shallow, its movements weak, and there was a glassy quality to its eyes that terrified me. I had to get it out of that snare, and I had to do it carefully. One wrong move could tighten the wire further or cause the fox to panic and hurt itself worse. I'd never felt pressure like this in my entire life. This tiny creature's survival depended entirely on my ability to stay calm and think clearly. I examined the snare as closely as I could without touching it. It was a simple loop design, tightened by the fox's own struggles. If I could somehow loosen the tension and expand the loop, I might be able to slip the paw free, but I needed something to manipulate the wire, something that wouldn't put my fingers at risk of getting tangled in the same trap. I looked around the clearing desperately and spotted a fallen branch about the right size. It wasn't ideal, but it might work. I spoke softly to the fox as I reached for it. I'm going to try something now, little one. It might be scary, but I need you to trust me, okay? I need you to stay as still as possible. The fox made a small sound that wasn't quite a cry, but wasn't quite silence either. If I didn't know better, I would have sworn it was trying to tell me it understood. I positioned the branch carefully against the wire, looking for the point where I could create the most leverage with the least disturbance to the fox's trapped paw. My hands were steady now, focused by the absolute necessity of the moment. There was no room for nervousness, no space for doubt. There was only this moment, this choice, this chance to save a life. I applied gentle pressure to the wire, and immediately the fox tensed. Easy, easy, I whispered. Almost there. The wire began to give slightly, creating just enough space that I thought I might be able to work the paw free. But I needed the fox to cooperate, to pull its paw back at exactly the right moment. This was the moment that would stay with me for the rest of my life. As I held that branch against the wire, creating precious millimeters of space, the baby fox looked directly into my eyes. And then, as if it understood exactly what needed to happen, it slowly and carefully began to withdraw its paw. The trust in that moment was absolute. This wild creature, caught in a human trap, in pain and terrified, had chosen to trust me completely. It moved with deliberate care, working with me instead of against me, following my gentle instructions as if we had been partners for years instead of strangers for minutes. The paw slipped free. The fox immediately pulled it close to its chest, cradling the injured limb while looking up at me with an expression I can only describe as gratitude. The relief that flooded through my body was so intense I nearly collapsed. We had done it. Somehow, impossibly, we had done it. But our ordeal was far from over. Now that the fox was free from the snare, I could see the full extent of its injuries. The paw was badly swollen and bleeding, but more concerning was the fox's overall condition. It was clearly dehydrated and weak from hunger and trauma. It tried to stand and immediately stumbled, unable to put any weight on the injured paw. I realized that freeing it from the trap was only the first step. This little creature needed medical attention, and it needed it fast. But I was still alone in the middle of the park with no way to call for help and no idea how to transport an injured wild animal. The fox solved part of that problem for me. As I sat there trying to figure out what to do next, the little creature began to slowly crawl toward me. Each movement was obviously painful, but it was determined to close the distance between us. When it finally reached my legs, it collapsed against me with a tiny sigh that seemed to contain all the exhaustion and relief in the world. In that moment, sitting in a small clearing with an injured baby fox pressed against my leg, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about rescuing an animal anymore. This was about connection, about the threads that bind all living things together, about the responsibility we have to care for the vulnerable and defenseless. I carefully scooped the fox into my arms, wrapping it gently in my jacket. It was lighter than I expected, all fur and delicate bones, and it trembled against my chest, like a tiny engine running on pure will. But it didn't struggle. It seemed to understand that I was help, not threat. The walk back through the park felt like a journey through a different world. Every step was careful, measured to avoid jarring the injured creature in my arms. The fox's breathing gradually steadied, and I could feel some of the tension leaving its small body. It was still alert, still watching everything around us, but the panic was gone. When we finally emerged from the eastern section of the park, the normal world came rushing back. Cars, people, noise, the busy rhythm of city life. But I felt like I was carrying something precious and fragile, something that needed protection from all of this chaos. I had no idea where to take an injured fox. The nearest veterinary clinic was Dr. Martinez's office about 6 blocks away, but would they even treat wild animals? I had no choice but to find out. The receptionist at Dr. Martinez's clinic took one look at the bundle in my arms and immediately called for the doctor. Within minutes, I was in an examination room, watching a kind-faced woman with gentle hands carefully examine my small patient. Dr. Martinez was everything I could have hoped for. She had the calm confidence of someone who had seen it all, but there was also a warmth in her eyes that told me she understood. This wasn't just another case. This was special. The fox submitted to her examination with the same trust it had shown me, as if it somehow knew that we were all on the same team now. Dr. Martinez worked quickly but carefully, cleaning the wound, checking for other injuries, administering fluids for dehydration. The paw isn't broken, she told me finally, but there's significant soft tissue damage. It's going to need time to heal, and it'll need to stay somewhere safe and quiet. Do you know anyone who rehabilitates wildlife? I didn't, but I was about to learn. That afternoon, I found myself in a place I never expected to be, the cramped but cozy office of Elena Vasquez, the only licensed wildlife rehabilitator within 100 miles of our city. Dr. Martinez had made the call, and somehow Elena had agreed to take the fox, despite being at capacity with other rescued animals. Elena's facility wasn't much to look at from the outside. A converted garage behind her modest house, surrounded by carefully constructed enclosures that housed everything from injured owls to orphaned raccoons. But the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the love and dedication that went into every square inch of the place. The fox, whom Elena immediately named Rusty, was set up in a special recovery enclosure, quiet, warm, and safe. For the first time since I'd found him that morning, I allowed myself to believe that everything might actually be okay. But Elena's next words stopped me cold. "He's not out of the woods yet," she said, her weathered hands gentle as she checked his IV line. "The physical injuries will heal, but trauma this severe, sometimes the spirit breaks before the body does. Wild animals aren't meant to be this helpless, this dependent. Some of them never recover from that psychological damage." I looked at Rusty, curled up in a soft blanket, his injured paw carefully bandaged. He looked so small, so fragile. The thought that he might simply give up, might lose the will to fight, made my chest tighten with an anxiety I didn't fully understand. "Can I visit him?" The words came out before I could stop them. I know he's wild, and I know I shouldn't get attached, but Elena's expression softened, and she nodded. "Actually, that might help. You're the one who saved him. In his mind, You might represent safety now. Sometimes that connection can be the difference between giving up and fighting to live. And so began the most extraordinary chapter of my life. Every morning before work, I would stop by Elena's facility. At first, Rusty would barely acknowledge my presence. He would lie curled in his blanket, those amber eyes distant and unfocused. The spark I had seen during the rescue seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a resignation that broke my heart. I started bringing my breakfast and eating it sitting beside his enclosure, talking to him about everything and nothing. My day at work, the weather, random thoughts that popped into my head. I told him about my childhood dog, about my dreams of traveling to places where wild foxes ran free through ancient forests. For 3 days, there was no response. Rusty ate the food Elena provided, submitted to medical checks, but showed no interest in anything beyond basic survival. Elena warned me that this was common, that wild animals often retreated deep into themselves when faced with trauma they couldn't process. But on the fourth morning, something changed. I was telling Rusty about a documentary I'd watched the night before, about Arctic foxes and their incredible ability to survive in impossible conditions, when I noticed his ear twitch. Just slightly, but it was the first voluntary movement I'd seen from him since the rescue. The next day, his head turned toward me when I arrived. The day after that, he lifted his head completely, those amber eyes focusing on my face with something that looked almost like recognition. By the end of the first week, Rusty was sitting up when I arrived, watching me with alert attention as I talked. His injured paw was healing well. The swelling had gone down significantly, and Elena was cautiously optimistic about his physical recovery. But it was his emotional recovery that amazed everyone. Elena had been rehabilitating wildlife for over 20 years, and she had never seen a wild animal respond to human presence the way Rusty responded to me. Not with dependence or domestication, but with what she called partnership. He remained wild, wary of other humans, quick to retreat when strangers approached. But with me, he was different. He would come to the front of his enclosure when I arrived, making soft, chittering sounds that Elena said were fox communication calls. He would watch my face intently when I spoke, tilting his head in a way that made it seem like he was actually listening. Most remarkably, when I was there, he would eat with appetite, play with the enrichment toys Elena provided, and show all the signs of a fox preparing to return to the wild. Word of Rusty's rescue had begun to spread through our small community. It started with Dr. Martinez mentioning it to a few clients, Elena sharing updates on her wildlife rehabilitation social media page, and me telling a few coworkers about my morning routine. But somehow, the story took on a life of its own. Local reporter Jake Morrison from the City Chronicle reached out, wanting to do a feature story about urban wildlife and the illegal trapping that was apparently happening in our public spaces. The interview I gave was supposed to be a brief human interest piece, but Jake was a skilled storyteller, and the article he wrote captured something deeper than just the facts of what happened. He wrote about connection in a disconnected world, about the capacity for compassion that exists in ordinary people, about how sometimes salvation comes not from professionals or experts, but from someone who simply refuses to walk away from suffering. The article ran on a Thursday morning, and by that afternoon, Elena's phone was ringing constantly. People wanted to know how Rusty was doing. They wanted to make donations to Elena's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. They wanted to volunteer, to help, to be part of something meaningful. The story had touched something in the community that had been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Mrs. Chen, who fed the pigeons every morning in the park, showed up with a homemade blanket for Rusty and a casserole for Elena. The local elementary school organized a fundraiser, with children bringing in their allowance money to help with Rusty's medical expenses. The hardware store owner, Mr. Thompson, donated materials to help Elena expand her facilities. But it wasn't just about Rusty anymore. The story had opened people's eyes to the wildlife that lived among us, often invisible, and always vulnerable. Park maintenance crews started checking more carefully for illegal traps. Dog walkers began reporting suspicious activity. The city council approved funding for wildlife corridors and better habitat preservation. 3 weeks after the rescue, I arrived at Elena's facility to find a small crowd gathered around Rusty's enclosure. Word had spread that this might be the day he would be released, and somehow a dozen people had shown up to witness it. I felt a moment of panic. This wasn't supposed to be a spectacle. Rusty was a wild animal, not a circus performer. But as I watched the faces of the people who had gathered, I realized they weren't there for entertainment. They were there because this little fox had become a symbol of something larger than himself. In a world that often felt overwhelming and hopeless, Rusty represented the possibility that individual actions could matter, that one person's refusal to look away could save a life, that communities could come together around something pure and good and make a real difference. Elena approached me with a gentle smile. "He's ready," she said simply. "Physically, he's completely healed. Emotionally, he's strong and confident. But I think he's waiting for something." I knew what she meant. Rusty had been watching the people gathered around his enclosure with alert curiosity, but when his eyes found mine in the crowd, something shifted in his posture. He stood up, walked to the front of the enclosure, and made that soft, chittering sound that had become his way of greeting me. It was time. The release was planned for that evening, just before sunset, in the same area of the park where I had found him. Elena explained that this would give Rusty the best chance to reorient himself and find shelter before full darkness fell. The crowd had dispersed, leaving just Elena, myself, and a few wildlife photography volunteers who would document the release for educational purposes. As we walked through the park carrying Rusty in his transport crate, I found myself thinking about the morning exactly 4 weeks ago when I had stumbled into that clearing and heard his cries for help. I was a different person now, changed in ways I was still discovering. My co-workers had noticed. My morning walks had become a ritual I looked forward to rather than endured. I had started volunteering at Elena's facility on weekends, learning about wildlife rehabilitation and discovering a passion I never knew existed. I was even considering going back to school, maybe studying veterinary medicine or wildlife biology. But more than that, I had learned something about myself that morning in the clearing. I had learned that I was capable of more courage, more compassion, more action than I had ever imagined. The woman who had walked into that park 4 weeks ago would have called for help and hoped someone else would handle the situation. The woman walking through it now knew that sometimes you are the help. We reached the clearing just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The trees looked different now, less wild and threatening, more like the sanctuary they were meant to be. Elena had worked with park services to ensure that the entire area had been thoroughly checked for additional traps, and new signs warned visitors to report any suspicious activity. Elena set the transport crate down in the center of the clearing and stepped back. This was Rusty's moment, his choice. The door was open, but no one would force him to leave. He could stay in the safety of the crate as long as he needed, or he could step out into his wild world and reclaim his life. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Rusty's black nose appeared at the opening of the crate, testing the air, reading the scents and sounds of his home territory. His head emerged next, ears swiveling as he cataloged every sound, every movement in the surrounding forest. Finally, with fluid grace that reminded me why foxes had inspired countless legends about magical creatures, Rusty stepped out of the crate and onto the forest floor. He was magnificent. His coat had grown thick and lustrous during his recovery, a rich red gold that seemed to glow in the evening light. His injured paw showed no sign of the trauma it had endured. He moved with the confident elegance of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. But before disappearing into the underbrush, Rusty did something that made my heart stop. He turned around and looked directly at me. Those amber eyes, so full of pain and fear when I had first seen them, now held something else entirely. Intelligence, certainly. Wildness, absolutely. But also something that looked remarkably like recognition, like gratitude, like farewell. We stared at each other across that small clearing, predator and prey, wild and domestic, fox and human. In that moment, I understood that some connections transcend species, that compassion creates bonds that can't be broken even when they must be released. Then Rusty did something that made Elena gasp softly beside me. He took 3 steps toward where I stood, stopped just beyond arm's reach, and made that soft, chittering sound one last time. It felt like thank you and goodbye, and until we meet again, all rolled into one perfect sound. The weeks following Rusty's release brought changes I never could have anticipated. What started as one person's decision to help a suffering animal had somehow sparked a transformation that rippled through our entire community like stones thrown into still water. Elena's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, which had been struggling financially for years, suddenly found itself overwhelmed with support. Donations poured in from across the state and beyond as Rusty's story spread through social media and news outlets. But more importantly, people were volunteering their time, their skills, their passion. Dr. Martinez partnered with Elena to establish a wildlife emergency response network. Local veterinarians agreed to provide pro bono services for rescued animals. The high school started a wildlife rehabilitation program, teaching students about conservation and care. Even the city government got involved, allocating funds for habitat preservation and launching an investigation into illegal trapping in public spaces. But the most profound changes were the ones happening in individual hearts and minds. Mrs. Chen, who had been feeding pigeons for decades, started learning about proper wildlife nutrition and became an advocate for responsible wildlife interaction. Mr. Thompson from the hardware store began stocking wildlife-friendly gardening supplies and offering workshops on creating backyard habitats. The elementary school that had fundraised for Rusty's care incorporated wildlife education into their curriculum permanently. As for me, the transformation was nothing short of radical. 6 months after Rusty's release, I submitted my resignation from the corporate job that had been slowly suffocating my soul. The decision terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure, but I knew I couldn't go back to spreadsheets and meaningless meetings when I had discovered work that actually mattered. I enrolled in a veterinary technology program with a specialization in wildlife medicine. The coursework was challenging, demanding every ounce of mental energy I possessed, but for the first time in my adult life, I woke up excited about the day ahead. Every lesson brought me closer to understanding the creatures I had fallen in love with. Every practical session taught me skills that could save lives. Elena became my mentor, teaching me not just the technical aspects of wildlife rehabilitation, but the deeper philosophy behind the work. She showed me how to read the subtle signs of an animal's emotional state, how to provide care that honored their wildness rather than diminishing it, how to make the difficult decisions that sometimes meant letting go. The learning curve was steep and sometimes heartbreaking. Not every rescue had a happy ending like Rusty's. I held dying animals that we couldn't save, made the difficult decision to euthanize creatures whose suffering couldn't be alleviated, and learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a wild animal was to give them a peaceful death rather than a painful life. But I also experienced miracles on a regular basis. There was Luna, the great horned owl who came to us with a shattered wing and learned to fly again through weeks of patient physical therapy. There was Charlie, the raccoon kit who had been orphaned when his mother was hit by a car and who grew from a palm-sized ball of fur into a confident, independent young adult, ready to take on the world. There was Sophie, the red-tailed hawk who had been shot by someone who saw wildlife as targets rather than treasures, and who overcame her injuries to become one of our educational ambassador animals. Each rescue taught me something new about resilience, about the incredible will to live that exists in all creatures, about the delicate balance between providing help and preserving wildness. But it was the return visits that touched my heart most deeply. Wildlife rehabilitators are taught to maintain professional distance to resist the urge to form emotional attachments to the animals in their care. The goal is always to return them to the wild, and successful releases mean saying goodbye forever. But nature doesn't always follow human rules about emotional boundaries. 3 months after his release, I was working in Elena's facility when movement outside caught my eye. A flash of red gold moving through the trees that bordered the property. My heart skipped, but I told myself it was just wishful thinking. Foxes were common in this area. It could be any fox. But then I heard it, that soft, chittering call that I had learned to recognize as Rusty's voice. I stepped outside, hardly daring to breathe, and there he was, standing at the edge of the tree line, healthy and beautiful and completely wild. He was larger now, his coat thick and lustrous, with good health and natural living. His injured paw showed no sign of weakness as he moved with the fluid grace of a perfectly adapted predator. But most remarkably, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a slightly smaller fox, her coat a more muted red-brown, her build suggesting she was female. They stood together with the comfortable intimacy of a bonded pair, and I realized that Rusty had not only survived his return to the wild, he had thrived. He had found love. The two foxes watched me for a long moment, and I could swear I saw recognition in Rusty's amber eyes. Then they turned and melted back into the forest. Two wild spirits living the life they were meant to live. I stood there long after they had disappeared, tears streaming down my face, not tears of sadness, but of pure joy. This was what success looked like in wildlife rehabilitation. Not just survival, but thriving. Not just living, but loving. That encounter became a story I shared with visitors to our facility, with students in the education programs we developed, with anyone who wondered whether they're individual. Do actions could really make a difference. Here was proof that they could. The ripple effects of Rusty's rescue continued to spread in ways both large and small. The local newspaper began running a weekly wildlife column, educating readers about the animals that shared our urban environment and how to coexist peacefully with them. The park system installed educational kiosks throughout the city, teaching visitors about local wildlife and reporting suspicious activities. Restaurants started participating in a wildlife-friendly certification program, agreeing to secure their dumpsters and use packaging that wouldn't harm animals if discarded. Schools incorporated wildlife education into their science curricula. Even the police department trained officers in basic wildlife emergency response. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way people began to see the world around them. Before Rusty, most residents of our city moved through their days focused on their immediate human concerns, barely noticing the wild creatures that lived alongside them. After his story spread, that began to change. People started paying attention to the birds in their backyards, the small mammals that emerged at dusk, the intricate web of life that existed in every park, every vacant lot, every green space in our urban environment. They began to understand that they weren't separate from nature, but part of it, that their choices affected not just their own lives, but the lives of countless other species. That compassion didn't have to be limited to their own kind. A year after Rusty's release, our Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had grown from Elena's converted garage to a proper facility with multiple buildings, dozens of volunteers, and partnerships with organizations across the region. We were rescuing and releasing more animals than ever before, but more importantly, we were preventing many rescues from being necessary through education and habitat improvement. The illegal trapping that had caught Rusty was virtually eliminated through increased surveillance and community reporting. The park system had been redesigned to provide better wildlife corridors and safer crossing points. The entire culture of our community had shifted toward one of stewardship and protection. But the changes weren't just happening in our small city. Rusty's story had been picked up by national media, inspiring similar initiatives in communities across the country. Wildlife rehabilitation centers reported increased donations and volunteer applications. Schools started wildlife education programs. City councils passed stronger protections for urban wildlife. One small fox, trapped in a wire snare on an October morning, had somehow sparked a movement that was changing how humans related to the natural world. As I reflect on that journey now, 2 years later, I'm amazed by the person I've become. The Sarah who walked into Riverside Park that October morning was lost, disconnected, going through the motions of a life that felt meaningless. She was someone who would have heard those cries for help and called 911, hoping someone else would handle the situation. The Sarah writing this story is someone who knows that sometimes you are the someone else. Sometimes the universe places you exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there, not because you're specially qualified, but because you're present and willing to act. I'm now a licensed veterinary technician specializing in wildlife medicine. I work full time at what is now called the Rusty Wildlife Rehabilitation and Education Center, named in honor of the little fox who started it all. Every day brings new challenges, new rescues, new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of creatures who have no voice in human society. But more than that, I'm someone who understands that compassion is contagious, that individual acts of kindness can spark community-wide transformations, that the connection between all living things isn't just a philosophical concept, but a practical reality that shapes how we should move through the world. I still take walks through Riverside Park every morning, but now they're part of my job. I check the trail cameras we've installed to monitor wildlife activity. I inspect the habitat improvement projects we've implemented. I look for signs of animals in distress and evidence of illegal activity. But mostly I listen, because that October morning taught me that if you really listen, the world is full of voices calling for help. Some are loud and obvious, impossible to ignore. Others are quiet, subtle, requiring you to slow down and pay attention. Some are human voices, some are animal voices, some are the whispered voices of wild places that need protection. Last week, I was walking through the eastern section of the park when I heard a sound that made my heart race, a high-pitched cry, desperate and afraid. For a moment, I was transported back to that October morning 2 years ago, feeling the same surge of adrenaline and determination. I followed the sound to its source and found a young raccoon with its paw caught in an illegal snare. Someone was still setting traps in our park, despite all our education efforts and increased surveillance. My heart sank at the realization that our work was far from over. But as I carefully freed the raccoon and examined its injuries, I felt something else too. Gratitude. Gratitude that I was there to hear its cry. Gratitude that I had the knowledge and skills to help. Gratitude that this little creature would get the same chance at life that Rusty had been given. The raccoon is recovering well at our facility. We've named her Hope, and she's already showing the same resilient spirit that I've learned to associate with wild creatures who refuse to give up. She'll be released in a few weeks, back to the wild life she was meant to live. And I'll be listening for the next cry for help, ready to answer it with everything I've learned about compassion, courage, and the incredible power of choosing to care. Because that's what Rusty taught me that October morning. Not just how to rescue a trapped fox, but how to rescue myself, how to transform from someone who felt helpless in the face of the world's suffering into someone who knows that every act of kindness matters, every life saved makes a difference, every moment of connection between species is a small miracle worth celebrating. The sound of that first cry still haunts my dreams sometimes, but now it's not a sound of terror and desperation. It's the sound of opportunity, the sound of a life calling out for help and finding it, the sound of hope refusing to give up. And in a world that often feels too broken to fix, too complicated to navigate, too overwhelming to face, that sound reminds me of a simple truth. Sometimes salvation comes down to one person who hears a cry for help and refuses to walk away. Sometimes that person is you. Sometimes the universe is waiting to see what you'll do when faced with suffering you have the power to alleviate. Whether you'll call someone else or step forward yourself, whether you'll turn away or turn toward, whether you'll choose comfort or courage. That October morning, I learned that I was capable of choosing courage. That discovery changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone whose life was touched by the ripples that spread out from that one moment of deciding to act. As I write these words, the sun is setting through my office window at the rehabilitation center. In the distance, I can see the lights of the city where Rusty was born, where he was trapped, where he was saved, and where he now lives free with his mate and the kits they've raised together. Tomorrow morning, I'll take my walk through the park again, listening for voices that need to be heard. And if I hear another cry for help, I'll follow it to its source, knowing that every rescue is a chance not just to save one life, but to plant seeds of compassion that can grow into forests of change. Because that's what love looks like in action. That's what hope sounds like when it refuses to give up. That's what happens when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things for creatures who can't speak for themselves, but whose lives matter just as much as any other. That's the lesson of a baby fox named Rusty, who was trapped in more than just a wire snare, but who broke free and taught an entire community how to break free as well. How to break free from indifference, from helplessness, from the illusion that individual actions don't matter. They do matter, more than we can possibly imagine. And sometimes they echo through the world like cries of joy instead of cries for help, reminding everyone who hears them that love always finds a way, hope always endures, and courage always makes a difference. Always.